Have you ever seen a puzzle that made you just go, oh my, this is so stupid? Well, I saw that one a few days ago, actually a while ago, but I saw it again today, a few days ago, and it made me think about it. So it's made by the company Ravensburger. I never said that name right. Someone tell me in the comments how you pronounce that correctly. Ravensburger, I'm just going to try to call for now, Ravensburger, whatever, is, well known for making very good puzzles, and I can admit they are very good puzzles. However, one of them is very bizarre in my opinion. It's supposed to be the map of the planets, and I'll leave a link to its Amazon page down below so you can look at it yourself or buy it or whatever. And no, I'm not going to do the generic science thing of talking about, actually, the spacing and the sizing is off because, well, A, duh, but B, an actually scientifically on-scale solar system would make a pretty bad puzzle. But, it would just be black. Mostly, tiny little dots here and there. But let's talk about this map, this puzzle picture or whatever, specifically because it's very interesting on some of the details that gets wrong. And by wrong, I mean this is way beyond wrong. They just literally made this up. So let's start in order from the sun to Mercury. And Mercury is, quite frankly, what am I looking at exactly? It looks orangey and fleshy and has these patches of green, but they don't look like life. They look like life, not like I don't know, they just don't look right. They don't look like plant matter, if that makes sense, like you see on Earth. And the orangish color is just so off from the gray rock Mercury normally is. It's very odd, and unlike some other things, it looks very alien. The only way I could describe it is almost like an infection covering or taking over all of Mercury as a system. But maybe that's just because I read too much analog horror or watch it. Moving on to Venus. Venus is, it basically just looks like an Earth-like planet. The planet looks a bit off, but overall looks pretty normal. There's a clear giant ocean where there should be giant sulfur clouds. And overall, it looks like a Venus that never went to the burning stage, where it maintained its Earth-like characteristics, or was terraformed at some point. Moving on back, we have Luna. It's specified Luna rather than the moon, because we're going to talk about another moon later. And Luna looks, at first, normal, and it could just be shading, but it looks blue, and I think the markings are off, which implies that the moon is a giant water world, or at least has liquid water on the surface, which is very different from the moon we know, and I hope I don't need to say that, but that could just be lighting. Moving on to one of Jupiter's moons, and I specify one of them because the map here specifies 4 of them, but it doesn't give names to them, and some of the pictures for each planet are so horribly off that I can't be entirely sure which of Jupiter's moons I'm looking at. I'm assuming it's one of the Galilean moons, but I can't be entirely sure, mostly because it also looks green, it has green vegetation on it, which is odd. Not theoretically impossible in a very theoretical sense, but very odd. And the last bit of things that stood out to me was Uranus and Neptune, which, surprise, surprise, at first look right, but the closer you look at them, the more they look off. In fact, that's why I did a more detailed look at it. They don't look to be gas giants. They look to be water worlds, with especially Uranus looking like it has archipelagos. Or, I guess, given the size of Uranus to Earth, probably proper continents, but they look like archipelago/ocean worlds, rather than the gas giants we know them today. And that is bizarre. A lot of weird details to not really get wrong, but purposely change. It's very fascinating and very kind of broken and hurts the astronomer physically a bit. But what would be the consequences of this shift in the structure of the planets? Well, let's get into that. One of the things that would change from basically day one would in fact be the simple fact that the planets would look different even to the naked human eye. Venus and Mercury, which can be seen by the human eye, would look different, and the moon would be associated with blue rather than silver. Most silverish, silver, gray, that kind of thing. There's no possible way to exactly determine how it would affect culture, but ultimately I won't get into that too much. But what would happen is very quickly, sooner or later, people would figure out these were life-bearing worlds. And I won't go into even close to the detail of whether these have humans or life naturally, or if they're Earth life or alien life, because that would take hours and hours of figuring out and pondering, and none of these are really hinted at via the puzzles, so I'd be just making stuff up. But what I can guarantee is that knowing these are life-bearing worlds since at least the early telescopic age, around the 17,000s or so, at least 1600s if, would immediately present that there was life outside of the planet. But of course, at this time, it would mostly be an interesting bit of speculation, and not even unheard of. The concept of other life-giving worlds was not unprecedented in those times. It was just not terribly common or thought of because it was thought as mostly pointless. However, this would become less pointless as technology advances and the ability to travel to these worlds become a thing. Now, in our timeline, the 1960s were roughly when this happened, due to a combining of factors, most of them being vaguely related to the space race. However, I would suspect that if we knew there were other life-giving worlds, rather than a barren wasteland out there, then yeah, that might encourage people to move a bit faster. However, many scientists assumed that Venus was a hot tropical planet for the longest time that we could just live on, with the biggest problem being dinosaurs and rainfall, and that didn't cause people to instantly build their rockets, so maybe, hard to tell. What is clear, though, is that by the time of the Cold War, assuming that all happens as it does in our timeline, it would immediately change the space race. In our timeline, the space race was mostly for international prestige. It had some other effects, like the thought of building weapon systems on the moon or in space, but mostly it was a prestige thing, who could win the space race, the Americans or the Soviets. But this changed the game. One is that if the moon is a life-bearing planet that you can just live on, then the difficulty of being on the moon is not how do we survive on the moon, but how do we get to the moon. I mean, after all, Neil Armstrong could just walked out in shorts if he was, if the moon was just water, or at least life-bearing, or habitable, or whatever. So I would suspect you would see the space race end a bit quicker. I'm not sure who would win it. I would suspect it might stay to the Americans, but the Soviets were bigger fans of rushing it, but it's hard to tell. However, what would immediately change afterwards is, there's a lot more you can do in this situation in the 1960s. One is that you would be, definitely by this point, you would be aware that Luna, Mercury, maybe Venus, Uranus, Neptune, and one of Jupiter's moons are all habitable planets. In the short term, this would start with early space colonization. I would suspect America and Russia to be the leaders of this race, or the Soviet Union, but I would suspect a few other nations throw in their hat, maybe allied with one or the other, or just doing their own thing. I wouldn't be shocked if England gets involved in this. However, this would come into conflict with any native life forms. If they're basically just Earth life, this becomes simple. If they're alien life, this becomes more difficult, and if there's intelligent life on these planets, this is going to get awkward. Another thing is that you'd probably see, I imagine, a growth in the hippie movement, purely because it'd be like, we're all connected to the planets, man. And no doubt some dirty hippie would go screaming about how, you can't industrialize these other planets because they're pure unlike our tainted Earth. Sorry, hatred of hippies bleeding out again. But overall, this would affect it. Expect any nation that has the capabilities and the ability to do so to expand to these planets, whether small and a few outposts or full-on colonization. I would suspect the Luna and Venus to be the main targets. As time would pass, I wouldn't be certain if the Soviet Union would stand as it did in our timeline. Would it fall and, like it did in our universe, or would it continue? I see two possibilities, is that either A, the national prestige could keep the Soviet Union together longer, so it might still be alive by our time, or constantly devoting resources outside of the place that's already cracking would just cause the Soviet Union to fall faster. It's hard to tell. But ultimately, I do think it will be a matter of time. In the future, this gets into hundreds of years, early stations into Jupiter's moon and Uranus and Neptune would go from purely scientific to more colonization, as Luna, Venus, and maybe Mercury become more filled up. Ultimately, this would change the game of space colonization. Mars wouldn't be thought of as much, as it would be less necessary, as it still looks to be a cold, barren wasteland. This would ultimately have the effect of kind of speed running America's space colonization, the human space colonization, as now we have multiple habitable worlds to live off of. The desire to look outside the solar system may be lessened by this fact, as in our solar system, we really only have one Earth-like planet. Even, remember, there are people who, quite rightfully, consider Venus or Titan to be the most Earth-like planets outside of the Earth. And pro tip, this is what living on a habitable Venus looks like, then this is what happens if you run around without a suit on Venus. Yeah, there's a difference. So ultimately, it's hard to predict how the story of mankind would go forward. I could see that either A, humanity would become more focused on the solar system and may spend quite a bit of time just not looking outwards as much past the solar system, as that would be less important compared to the more medial other worlds we colonize. Remember, these are quite a bit of Earths to work with, so we might become somewhat isolationist for a while. Alternatively, if we logically deduce that every solar system has several Earth-like planets, then looking at them is more worthwhile. However, of course, you also see advances in space technology as, of course, to increase speed, production, and, overall getting to the planets. And since our space race led to us developing numerous new technologies, it's quite interesting as this universe might be way more technologically advanced from even an earlier on point, since their space race will be much larger and do other things. Now, of course, it can always boil over into World War III, and the nations collapse, and the colonies spread across the stars, all split off into numerous sub-factions, but you never know. Ultimately, I'm probably putting more thought into this puzzle than people who just thought it would look cool. But anyway, hope you enjoy this little thought experiment, and I'll see you next time. Yeah? Hey, why don't you hit that sub button? You're gonna become a subscriber. Get to see my content quicker. Wouldn't that be nice? I bet so.